So, I usually review books that I either liked or really liked. I don't usually do individual book reviews for anything that doesn't fall within that category, but I wanted to do one for Nevernight by Jay Kristoff because I had some very mixed opinions about this book that I wanted to share with you, really. So starting off with what this book is about, we follow a character named Mia Corvair who goes to an assassin school to learn to be an assassin to get revenge for the wrongs done on her family. And it is a fantasy novel. The world is pretty interesting. It is a planet with 3 suns, and the reason the book is called Nevernight is because there is never really night apart from once every 3 years. There's always one of the 3 suns up, which I thought was a really interesting premise for this world. It's almost a little bit sci-fi-esque, which was nice. And there is a little bit of magic system going on, which I'm not going to go into for the sake of avoiding spoilers. The plot line was interesting. The characters were interesting. The world was interesting. But none of them were amazing. I liked them fine, but I wasn't like, oh my gosh, I need to know what happens next. I absolutely love this character. I can't believe what's going on. It's so intriguing. It was never a strong positive reaction at any point, but unfortunately there were a few strong negative reactions from me whilst I was reading this. And they all stemmed really from the narrative style. So this book is narrated by a third party, and I have my suspicions about who that third party is, but we don't know while the story is being told. So it's told in third person omniscient narrative, I think. So the narrator knows everything that's going on and knows everything that's going to happen and is feeding you information gradually throughout the book, which is interesting, and I don't think that I often read narrative styles like that. The issue that I had is that the choices that were made within that narrative style. The author, Jay Kristoff, heavily relies on footnotes throughout the book, and there's a mix of what they're used for. Predominantly, they are used for world building. There are also some jokes in the footnotes as well. Now, what I will say is that the author's sense of humour is not my sense of humour. Most of the time when jokes were being made, I didn't find them at all funny, but that's a personal preference thing, so I'm not being critical of that. It just wasn't to my taste. What I did dislike though was the use of footnotes for world building. I read a lot of epic fantasy, and in that epic fantasy the world building can become very complex, it can become very in-depth, but I found the use of footnotes really difficult for 2 reasons really. The first was it just felt a little bit lazy to me to use the footnotes in that way for world building rather than incorporating the world building into the story. And 2, following on from that, is that it then took you out of the story because it wasn't incorporated into what was happening in the scene. It was, oh, hold on a minute while I tell you about this part of the world. And alongside that, I found that a lot of that world building was actually completely irrelevant and came off like the author was just trying to show off about this massive world that he'd built in his head, which is great. World building should be intricate, it should be in depth, and I think a sign of really good world building is when an author has worked out all of those minute details and the history of their world and the cultural implications of things, but not all of that needs to end up on the page there can be reference to it so that we know that the author has thought about these things, but we don't actually need it spelled out. So for example, this is not a spoiler, but there was at one point when the characters, a couple of the characters were talking, and one of the characters started smoking a specific type of cigar. It was specified that it was a specific brand of cigar, which to me says, okay, so the author's thought about this. There are brands in this fantasy world. Great. But then he puts in a footnote to explain the origins of that brand, which had absolutely no reference to the story whatsoever, took me out of what was happening in that scene, which was an important scene between a couple of characters having a conversation about something I presume was important. I can't even remember now, because all I remember about that scene is the fact that it was completely ruined, in my opinion, by this footnote about something completely irrelevant about this family that made a cigar company. I just don't understand that narrative choice, and that type of world building just really did not work for me. Another thing that I found slightly irritating about the narrative style was the fact that at certain points throughout the story, the reader was treated like an idiot by the narrator. So for example, where I mentioned before that this planet has 3 suns, the first time in the book that we become aware of that fact is when our protagonist Mia, and again this isn't a spoiler, it's right at the very beginning of the book, is watching the setting of the 3rd sun. Pretty much a direct quote. Setting of the 3rd sun. Okay, there are 3 suns. Cool, got you. Then, a couple of pages later, the author sees fit to reiterate that there are 3 suns. Okay, I could let that one slide. Then a page later, we get a full-on direct explanation about the fact that there are 3 suns, and it's like, yeah, I got that both the first and the second time. Now I just feel talked down to. I am not an idiot. I picked up on the 3 suns thing the first time you said it, let alone the second. I definitely didn't need a third. And whilst the footnote explaining about the 3 suns was interesting, again, I felt like that could have been better incorporated into the main plot of the story without taking you out of the story, without talking down to the reader, and without having to have a footnote to explain the world building rather than just including the world building in the actual story. So basically, I just wasn't a fan of the narrative style that this was written in for all of those reasons. I also found it a little bit slow, but again, that was probably because of the footnotes constantly taking me out of the story. At least that's how I felt. Towards the end, there were less footnotes, and so the pacing picked up a little bit for me. Now, whether or not I read books 2 and 3 of this series, Book 2 is called God's Grave and is out already. Book 3 I can't remember the name of, I'll try and write it somewhere, but it's coming out later this year. Whether I get around to them, I probably will pick them up at some point, but I'm not going to be prioritising them. I've got a lot of other books on my TBR that I would much rather read and that I'm much more invested in reading than this series, which is a real shame because the premise sounded perfect for me, but the writing style just did not suit my reading tastes whatsoever. And I think that this is a very, very Marmite book. I gave it 3 stars, but I saw on Goodreads that the majority of star ratings were either 5 or 1 or 2. So it is a very much love it or hate it kind of thing, I think, with this narrative style. I gave it a 3 purely because the narrative style wasn't for me, but I did enjoy the story enough to not give it a 2. I didn't hate it, so it was nowhere near a 1 for me. But I wanted to do this video because of the fact that it is going to be such a polarising book that I hoped that maybe my thoughts would be helpful for you on deciding whether or not you want to pick this up. As usual in these videos, I am going to quickly read you a little bit from the beginning of the book, so here we go. The boy was beautiful, Caramel smooth skin, honeydew sweet smile, black curls on the right side of unruly, strong hands and hard muscle, and his eyes, oh daughters, his eyes, 5,000 fathoms deep, pulling you in to laugh even as he drowned you. His lips brushed hers, warm and curling soft. They'd stood entwined on the bridge of whispers, a purple blush pressing against the curves of the sky. His hands had roamed her back, current tingling on her skin. The feather-like brush of his tongue against hers set her shivering, heart racing, insides aching with want. They'd drifted apart like dancers before the music stopped, vibrations still thrumming along their strings. She'd opened her eyes, found him staring back in the smoky light. A canal murmured beneath them, its sluggish flow bleeding out into the ocean, just as she wished to. Just as she must, praying she wouldn't drown. Her last Nevernight in this city. A part of her didn't want to say goodbye, but before she left she wanted to know she owed herself that at least. "Are you sure?" he asked. She looked up into his eyes then, took him by the hand. "I'm sure," she whispered. The man was repugnant. Sclerosis skin, a shallow chin lost in the folds of stubbled fat, a sheen of spittle at his mouth, whiskey's kiss scrawled across his cheeks and nose and his eyes. Oh daughters, his eyes, blue as the sun's burned sky, glittering like stars in the still of true dark. His lips were on the tankard, draining the dregs as the music and laughter swelled about him. He swayed in the taverner's heart a moment longer, then tossed a coin on the ironwood bar and stumbled into the sun's light. His eyes roamed the cobbles ahead, bleary with drink. The streets were growing crowded, and he forced his way through the crush, intent only on home and a dreamless sleep. He didn't look up, didn't spy a figure crouched atop a stone gargoyle on a roof opposite, clothed in plaster white and mortar grey. The girl watched him limp away across the Bridge of Brothers, lifting her harlequin's mask to drag on her cigarillo, clove-scented smoke trailing through the air. The sight of his carrion smile and rope-raw hands set her shivering, heart racing, insides aching with want. Her last Nevernight in this city. A part of her still didn't want to say goodbye. Before she left, she'd wanted him to know she owed him that at least. A shadow wearing the shape of a cat sat on the roof beside her. It was paper flat and semi-translucent, black as death. Its tail curled around her ankle almost possessively. Cool waters seeped out through the city's veins and into the ocean, just as she wished to, just as she must, still praying she wouldn't drown. "Are you sure?" the cat, who was a shadow, asked. The girl watched her mark slink towards his bed, nodded slowly. "I'm sure," she whispered. And hopefully that gives you an idea of the general writing style of the book. It doesn't carry on like that throughout the whole story, but there is a little bit of that kind of parallel narrative for a little while. It's not really demonstrative of the issues that I was talking about, but those don't really start off until a little bit further into the book, and I don't really want to skip to that because you then miss some stuff that you really need. Well, you really should know before you get to those points. But I hope that that was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button. And I hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.